Hello, and welcome to the Outcry Theatre Podcast. My name is Becca Johnson-Spinos.
And I'm Jason Johnson-Spinos, and we will be co-hosting this episode of the podcast, where we will be talking to costumer Katie Guiou.
Katie has worked on over a dozen Outcry Youth Theatre productions, as well as 2 Outcry professional productions. Hi, this is Becca Johnson-Spinos, Artistic Director of Outcry Theatre.
And this is Jason Johnson-Spinos, Marketing Director at Outcry Theatre. And we're here with
Katie Guiou. I am the Vice President of the Board for Outcry, and I've worked with both Becca and Jason on costumes.
So, Katie, the first show you did costumes for was my summer production of The Little Mermaid Jr., and I just want to see what that process was like for you. Did you have any idea what you were getting yourself into?
I really had no idea at all what it took to do costumes for a show, and figured it out as we went along with that first show. But Jason, I loved working with you on that show because I remember you had a great vision. And for that show, I remember you specifically didn't want the kids dressed up in, fish costumes or crab costumes on stage. And so we did this concept where they would wear street clothes that would look like the costumes and the colors would have looked. And that was a great way to go. I think it would have been a completely different experience if they had worn big fish costumes.
We were essentially doing the Disney-bound version of Little Mermaid.
I remember Sebastian wore a red pantsuit with gloves, and Flounder had on a yellow top and blue pants. Scuttle had on a feathery jacket with orange shoes, and it was that kind of thing to portray the characters. It was a lot of fun.
So, Katie, how did you get involved with Outcry in the first place?
I first learned of Outcry through word of mouth. We had known a couple of different families that had kids do shows with Outcry, and all 3 of my kids have done at least one show with Outcry. My middle kiddo, I think, did 19 shows. My daughter did, I believe, 14 shows, and my oldest did 1 show with Outcry. So that's really how it started, was having my own kids participate in shows. And along the way, I was looking for ways that I could get involved and volunteer. And the first kind of big thing I did was volunteer to do costumes with Jason on one of his shows. And from there, I've now been on the board for a couple of years. This year, I'm the vice president of the board. And I really love just being involved with Outcry in any capacity I can.
For Outcry Youth Theatre, which you were designing costumes for, usually what the costume coordinator does is create a costume plot with pieces that are usually to be purchased for the show that we're doing. And that's what we did for the first few shows that we did together. But by the time we got to Moana Jr., you began making a bunch of costume pieces yourself, which was really kind of like a big shift. And I just wanted to talk to you a little bit about that and how you became really a costume maker as well.
And really, with that show, I feel like it was more out of necessity than anything else. For Moana, we very carefully wanted to avoid any type of cultural appropriation in costuming. We wanted to be respectful of the Polynesian culture. And we also didn't want our costumes to look like they came from Party City with the really thin, cheap fabrics, and to look just too much maybe on the nose in terms of copying the movie. And we really wanted a variety of texture and patterns and colors. And we did not want plastic grass skirts, and we did not want bikini tops made out of coconut shells. And so really, since I couldn't find anything available for purchase, I just started experimenting with burlap and different fabrics that had different colors and patterns, and trying to make them look like the characters looked in the movie, but at the same time not copying them completely. So that's really where that came from. And I found that it was a lot of fun, and I really enjoyed it, doing the crafting.
So the first show that you costume designed for me was The Secret Garden. And I know that you were very intimidated and worried about working with me. Talk about the challenge of a huge giant period piece like that show.
I was definitely intimidated to work with you, Becca, but also intimidated by that show in general because it had a very big cast and it was a period piece. That show, first of all, took place right around 1900, right around the turn of the century between the 1800s and 1900s. And suit jackets back then are not like suit jackets today. The suit jackets are longer and they typically have 4 buttons instead of 1 or 2. And we had to really pay attention to details. Men's pants had higher waists and wider legs. So those were some challenges for me as I was first doing a period piece and learning about the details to look for. For the women, I found that it was really difficult to make sure that the costumes all looked like they came from the same universe. And I think what I mean by that is when you're looking at period costumes for the girls, it's real easy to combine kind of Marie Antoinette with Civil War, with late Victorian, with bustle skirts into the Edwardian period that's more like Titanic costumes. And so finding enough different options that looked like they all came from the same world, I remember was a definite challenge in doing that show.
The ball gowns were so beautiful. I can't believe that we pulled it off. I feel like we found every single floral ball gown that existed in the world and we got them. Also, I made you do the white version of every single costume that we already had. Katie had to come up with a all white version of everything.
And I remember saying, Becca, are you sure we need this? Do we have to do all white? And that was particularly challenging because we had some military guys in that show and they had kind of a light army green or a dark tan color to their uniforms. And then we had to get a white version of that as well. So every guy that played a military character had to have his tan suit and his white suit. And the ladies had to have a white version of their costume. So it was another costume that everyone had to buy. And we also did hats for that all white scene. So I remember that was a really beautiful detail, seeing it on stage. And when the lights came up on Act 2 and everybody's on stage in those white costumes, it was a wow moment for the audience. No one expected that. And I was wowed, even though I'd been a part of the process all the way through. But the dresses and the hats and those white suits and the guys had on white shoes, it was honestly breathtaking.
So last year we did the SpongeBob musical, and there are a lot of challenges to that show, including the fact that almost everyone plays like a million different characters. And of course, they're all, cartoons. It's a very difficult show to costume. But we also have a character who has an extra pair of legs in Squidward. And not only does he have an extra pair of legs, he also has to be able to do a giant tap number with those legs. So talk a little bit about that show and all the different aspects of costume designing that production.
We could honestly do a 2-hour podcast and just talk about the SpongeBob costumes. It was a really, really fun show to costume and by far the biggest show that I've ever costumed. And if I'm not mistaken, I do think we had at least 5 ensembles. And every ensemble costume was fairly elaborate. There was one ensemble costume where each actor had to have sea anemones on their head and on their hands and on their feet. So they had to have these furry, elaborate headpieces that were really a lot of fun. But there were details like that went into a lot of these numbers. I remember one of the challenges before I get to Squidward's legs was his jacket. And at the beginning of the tap dancing number, I believe Squidward had all of 1 8 count to completely change into a sparkly Las Vegas style blazer jacket with a different shirt and a bow tie. And that truly was 1 8 count that we had to get Squidward into that costume. Just a lot of planning and practice that went into that, and sewing 3 items into one piece and using magnets and lots of different things we did to make that happen. Starting with Squidward's legs. So Squidward had his regular front two legs and he had his back legs. And I've seen many different versions of the SpongeBob musical, and in most of them, they use pool noodles for the back legs, and they somehow stuff them into just another pair of shoes. And during that tap number, I've never seen another production except Broadway where Squidward wears tap shoes on all 4 feet. For most productions, Squidward doesn't wear tap shoes at all. He has one set of legs and one set of feet, and he does tap dancing, but in regular street shoes that don't make the tapping sound. So that was a huge challenge for us, is we've got to make sure when we design these legs that we're able to have Squidward change shoes very quickly backstage. We've got to make sure that the front legs and the back legs have taps. That was important. That was really part of Becca's vision for the number. And probably the thing that made it the most challenging was the elaborate choreo that Squidward did. And it was, if I'm not mistaken, the full Broadway choreo. And even then, I think it was a little embellished. We had 2 amazing tap dancers that played the role of Squidward. And they tapped aggressively, I guess I should say. So we broke and had to remake, I want to say dozens of legs, but that would be an exaggeration. But it was easily 6 different pairs of legs. And I don't know how many iterations of the shoes we ended up going through before we finally found a solution. And I even recall during promo photos that Squidward's legs came detached from the shoes during promos. And by the end of the time, I think only one of the 4 legs was still working, which was a little scary because we were really about to head into Tech Week. And I realized that what we had done was not going to work.
I still remember Katie before every single performance backstage with the legs, getting them ready to go. It was like the pre-show ritual was Katie was there with all of her tools, making sure Squidward's feet were complete and everything was together, which goes to show the dedication that you had to that production and making all of that happen, because many lesser costume designers would have given up on that project.
Oh, man. And so I walked around with my drill. I felt like a NASCAR pit crew a little bit, because when Squidward changed shoes, we had to have a prosthetic foot that went into the back shoes, and it required unbolting and rebolting the new shoes onto Squidward's wooden legs. Our legs were made of wood with marine quality hinges, because the hinges you get at the Home Depot ripped apart time after time. That was one of the many lessons we learned along the way. And it was always stressful for me. I would go backstage to help the Squidwards with their shoe change. I remember at least twice we almost didn't get everything securely bolted before he had to dash out on stage. So it was always a little stressful.
You also were the costume designer for one of our professional productions, which was Lipstick Traces. What was that experience like?
It was a lot of fun, and it really was different for a few different reasons. You know, one, it was a smaller cast. Each actor did have multiple costumes for the most part, but it wasn't quite as many people, which made it a little less stressful and more fun. Another thing is that for the professional shows, Outcry provides the costumes to the actors. So not only was I sourcing the pieces, but I was actually purchasing the pieces, which was great. I didn't have to track anybody down and make sure they had their costumes and make sure everything was ready for the stage. But it also was a little bit of a challenge because I had to keep track of everybody's sizes, you know, for their pants and their shirts and their shoes. But doing the pro show it just had a different feel.
What was the most challenging part about that process?
There really were 2 things I think that were challenging about that process. And the first one is dealing with the time periods, which we've had to do in multiple shows. But one of the time periods we dealt with, the year specifically was 1916 with the Dadaist movement. So making sure that we had costumes that felt right and true to that time period. And then we also had the Situationists in the late 50s to early 60s. So that was a whole nother vibe and a whole different feel to those costumes. And then we did the Sex Pistols. So it was specifically a recreation of the Bill Grundy interview from 1976. And that really brings me to the second part of it that was so challenging, was when you're costuming real people, and especially from a real event or situation where we really wanted to get those details right. And we wanted to make sure that the clothing, the jewelry, the shoes, everything we did for the recreation of that interview felt right and was as close to what really happened as we could possibly make it. So really those two things, the different time periods and costuming real people that the audience is more likely to be familiar with.
What do you love about doing costumes?
I love seeing it all come together. There are many different phases of the process, and I think the hardest part for me is when we're first putting the costume plot together, because it takes a lot of research. It's always hard to find the right thing, or I find the right thing and it's really expensive, or it doesn't come in the right sizes, or it won't get here in time. Putting the costume plot together takes a lot of time, a lot of back and forth to make sure that I am executing the director's visions, because really that's my job as a costume coordinator. I'm not designing my own concept for the show. I am meeting with Becca or Jason and getting their vision for the costumes, and it's my job to execute that and bring it to life and make sure that it's feasible for the actors to do that. And then after the costume plot goes out, there are lots of questions that come back and forth. So that takes quite a bit of time. The fun part for me is when we get into Tech Week and I'm seeing the costumes for the first time, and I get to see how cool they look together, because up to that point, I've only ever seen each actor's costumes on a computer screen or on a piece of paper. But seeing them actually in the flesh and seeing how they all go together and watching it come together, that's really the best part. It's very satisfying and fun to watch it come together at the end.
You've done so many amazing things that we haven't even talked about. For Anna Karenina, you built all these military jackets because you and I couldn't agree on a style, which is hilarious. We had a disagreement, and so you ended up building them yourself. That was great. You made a snake costume, which is really cool, part puppet, part costume. You made whole dresses for Anna Karenina, which is amazing, out of curtains that were just sitting in your house. You've done so many amazing things that we haven't touched on. But the real question is, we need to settle once and for all, which one of us is harder to work with, me or Jason?
You know I'm not going to answer that question. And there really isn't an answer to the question, because you're different and you have different approaches. And I think there were some challenges with Jason, and Becca, there were some challenges in working with you. And you guys are both picky about different things. So there were certain things that, Jason would really we'd go back and forth multiple times on a costume piece. And if I was working with you, Becca, that would be something that you wouldn't care about at all, and probably vice versa. Like those jackets you were referring to in Anna Karenina, I was hung up over the collar. I wanted a Mandarin collar, and you were more hung up on the double-breasted, if I'm not mistaken.
And the length.
And we just could not come to a common ground. So yeah, in the end, I ended up finding a pattern and making the coats. And then I also, for that show, we also needed a white version of the suit. And so after making the navy blue jackets for those actors, I wanted the white version. It was so important to me. And in that, Becca, I remember you didn't care as much about that. If we didn't have the white jacket, you didn't care. I had to have the white suit. Not only the jacket, but the pants too. It was a really fast, quick change, and they didn't always make it. But whenever they made that entire quick change with the jacket and the pants, it made it all worth it.
As you mentioned, you've been with Outcry for years now, doing so many different things for us, including being, as you said, our vice president for a couple of years now, on our board, and just being a huge volunteer for us for many, many years. What does Outcry mean to you?
Outcry changes lives. And I know that probably sounds possibly cliche to say that, but I believe it. And I've seen it with my own children, and I've seen numerous examples of that in other kids that I've worked with. Kids whose entire lives were transformed by becoming a part of a family, finding a group of friends, getting the confidence that they get from theater. Some kids have been in very dark mental places, and this process of coming to Outcry and working with Becca and Jason has helped really change the course of their situation and of their lives. So I also really appreciate the life lessons that you both teach the children, and I've seen it in my own kids. An example I have is when my middle child was auditioning for Newsies. He almost didn't audition because of the dancing. And at the time, he was deathly afraid of learning the choreography and didn't think he could do it. And he and I had this conversation about, in life, you're going to have to learn how to do hard things. And he did. He made it through. It wasn't always pretty or easy, but he made it through. And just recently, we were talking about his college coursework and how difficult his fall is going to be. And he said, but remember, Mom, I can do hard things. So that's just one example of the life lessons that Outcry teaches, but also being part of a team and self-discipline and preparation and putting your best self on stage, even when it's hard or you don't feel good, all of those things and so many more. So I love that about Outcry. And then I also love the professional quality of the shows. Truly, you don't feel like you're watching youth theater. It's professional theater. I've seen a lot of different pro and, youth and school shows. The quality of work that I have seen come from the Outcry stage is unparalleled and unlike anything I've seen really anywhere else. So I love the bold artistic vision. So it's this boldness and it's this energy that comes from Outcry that's really unmatched.
Well, thank you so much for talking with us, Katie.
Thanks for having me. This was really fun. It's fun thinking back on all the different shows we've worked on together.
Thank you so much for joining us for this episode of the Outcry Theatre Podcast. This episode has been produced by Becca Johnson-Spinos
and edited by Jason Johnson-Spinos. For more information about Outcry Theatre, you can find us on Facebook, Instagram, or outcrytheatre.com. If you enjoyed this podcast, please share with your theater-loving friends and leave us a rating and a review in your podcast app.